Hello and welcome back to the Red Path. Today we're going to look at how to understand and master the fight phase. There are many aspects to the fight phase that we need to consider, from the correct application of pressure to the understanding of how best to maneuver your units. I will be releasing several videos examining different aspects of the fight and charge phases, but today I'm going to try and help clarify some opportunities for confusion. The fight phase is our phase, is where our legion ought to dominate, both fluff-wise and crunch-wise. Narratively, close combat is what the World Eaters are all about, only able to find any kind of satiety or pleasure whilst in the throes of bloodshed. Rules-wise, almost every aspect of our legion's abilities and strategy is focused on combat, whether getting into it, enhancing it, or prolonging it. Given this, it is imperative that we as World Eaters players wholly understand the nuance and intricacy of the fight phase, and let me tell you, in 9th edition, it is both nuanced and intricate. I will describe sequences as simply as possible and offer visual guides where I can, but trust me, this one is a doozy. So first, let's get the absolute basics down with some glossary. On the screen you should see some definitions, but I'll read them out in case you're not actually watching. The fight phase. This is the part of the round where players alternate combat between eligible units. Eligible units. These are units on the tabletop who are within engagement range of an enemy unit at the start of the fight phase. Charged or charging. A unit that has successfully performed a charge move in the preceding phase and will be part of the army of the player whose turn it is. Charged. A unit of the player whose turn it is not, which was the target of a successful charge. Fights first. A unit with an ability, such as psychic power or stratagem, that allows it to always fight first. Generally this means counts as charging, but slightly better. Fights twice. This can mean units with blood for the blood god or something similar, i.e. the second fight is not restricted to the end of the phase. Current player, the player whose turn it is, and opposing player, the player whose turn it is not. And fights last. This is probably the biggest monkey wrench, as there are various versions of this, but essentially fights last, unless otherwise stated, makes a unit fight last or, in the fighting last subphase, or negates a unit's charged or fights first ability. Geesh, okay, I said this was going to be complicated, didn't I? Anyway, so we need to play some mental gymnastics to better understand this, I think. The best method I've found to simplify the fight phase is in two ways. First, I split the fight phase up into subphases. Subphase 1, units that fight first, Subphase 2, units that fight normally, and Subphase 3, units that fight last. And second, I reimagine the order of combat as a hierarchy of status effects. For instance, charged is a buffing status effect. The controlling player's turn is a buffing status effect. Causes other units to fight last is a debuffing status effect. With these two perspectives, I find it easier to reconcile the dozens of permutations that can and will occur during a complicated fight phase. So let's look at these subphases first. A unit can be bounced between subphases depending on their own and enemy abilities, stratagems and traits. Subphases help you order your units, and the majority of units will sit in subphase 2. They are not affected by any special rules or abilities. Units in subphase 1 have a datasheet ability, psychic boon or other codex-based buff that propels them into a better subphase, fights first for example. Units in phase 3 are generally affected by an opponent's datasheet ability that relegates them into a worse subphase, fights last or fights after all other eligible units. If there are no buffs or debuffs to a fight phase, no charging models etc., then all units sit in subphase 2. If a unit has charged, then that unit is in subphase 1. If a unit has charged, but is also affected by an enemy ability that causes it to fight last, it is in subphase 2. Heck, look, here's a table. There are various other things that could be included here, but I'm dealing with the most common and most likely. There's at least one unit that utterly breaks the rules, custodies with their stooping dive. Be aware of that rule whenever you face them. But moving on from that pretty much unique ability, charging and fights first add priority to a unit's status effect. At least one of these statuses can be negated by a fights last, but by looking at the table we can see. A unit with fights first and charge will have precedence. However, if an opponent has a unit with fights first, then they get to go after your first charging unit. Then you simply swap activations back and forth in equal status bands of subphase priority until all units are exhausted. Generally, the most complex interactions will occur in the very beginning of the fight phase when trying to navigate the convoluted rules that affect unit precedence. The status a unit has is what determines where it sits. If it has the charge status, but also the fights last status, it loses both. If it has the fights first, charged, and fights last status, first and last cancel each other out, but charged remains. Essentially, most status add or subtract 1 point of fightiness, and can move a unit between subphases if that fightiness level is above or below the required threshold. However, note that some abilities, Temper Mortis for example, do not care how many status buffs you have. You fight after all eligible units have fought, so it's a very hard counter to fighter units. Okay, so hopefully so far we're understanding the basics of how to order your units in the fight phase, and how different abilities manipulate order of precedence. For further reading and a much more in-depth look, I'd recommend this Goonhammer article. But what about maximising our own fight phase? Knowing how to engage in it is one thing, but mastering it is another. Well, I've been putting out content on enhancing your berserkers for the field, so definitely check out those videos when you get a chance. And next week I intend to release a video on maximising pile-ins and consolidations, and any other kind of movement shenanigan in the charge and fight phase. Something we have to be good at to maximise our potential in 9th edition. I hope this way of looking at things is helpful. The fight phase can be a labyrinth to navigate, but as an avid RPG player, oh yeah, it's December the 13th when I'm recording this, by the way, and I've just finished a long week of work, with Cyberpunk 2077 sitting installed but unplayed. Instead of playing it, I'm recording this. I think that counts as dedication to the cause, right? Anyway, as an avid RPG player, I find that assigning subphases and status effects to my units helps me better synthesize the order of operations. Your thought processes probably work different to mine, so I recommend you try and apply a process that you are comfortable with to define this convoluted mess. Honestly, at this point, I think an initiative system might just be the best thing all round. Anyway, that's the end of this one, folks. Have a great week. Stay healthy, stay safe, and kill main burn.